They call her my guardian. I call her my warden. The stroke took my ability to speak clearly, but the pills she gives me ensure I never regain it. I am not recovering. I am the brilliant, silent prisoner of the woman I trusted for 40 years.
My name is Eleanor, Elvira Vance. Most of my life, my name meant something here on the rainy, beautiful Washington coastline. It meant taste, good fortune, and, most importantly, unshakable control. I didn't have family. My fortune was self-made, and my circle was chosen with surgical precision. Even after a stroke 5 months ago nearly silenced me entirely, I was determined to fight my way back to the person who controlled her own life. The first stroke left me weak, confused, and prone to losing the simple act of putting words into order. The second one, 6 weeks ago, took almost everything. My mobility, my speech. Doctors call it aphasia. I call it a gag in my throat. And worst of all, my freedom. I became the reluctant, beautiful prisoner inside my own magnificent house overlooking Puget Sound. It's a house filled with antique lace, sun-bleached driftwood, and most cruelly, my vast, unused collection of yarns and silk thread. My warden is Bethany. Bethany has been my social liaison and administrative agent for 40 years, a title I gave her to mask the truth that she was the one reliable person I needed around, managing my books and organizing my life with a cool, capable hand. After the stroke, her role was redefined by the lawyers as my sole guardian and power of attorney. She moved in entirely, bringing her soft shoes, her soothing voice, and her absolute smothering presence. She controlled every conversation, every medication dose, and every person allowed past the main gate. At first, I accepted the kindness. I needed the care. I needed the gentle strength she projected as she organized my medical visits, handled the daunting stack of bills, and reassured my long-distant relatives, the ones waiting for my final moment, that everything was fine and that I was resting comfortably. But over the last 2 weeks, a profound, gut-wrenching dread has begun to crawl across my conscious mind. The single place Bethany can't lock the door on. I'm getting better. Not completely recovered, but better. The words in my mind are slowly reconnecting, and the strength is returning to my hands, particularly my dominant right hand. I can almost form clear thoughts, and with great effort, I can even trace a complex pattern on paper. But Bethany doesn't see it. Or rather, she actively refuses to see it. Every small, desperate gesture I make, the successful retrieval of a lost word, like T, the minute improvement in the position of my arm movement, is instantly greeted with her professional, devastatingly kind correction. "Oh, Elvira, that's wonderful. Your spirit is so strong. But please, don't strain yourself. Rest is paramount." And with those simple, soft words, she administers the specific medication that makes the lights dim behind my eyes, dulling my fine motor control, slurring the words I was finally starting to recapture. The kindness is a cage built of velvet. She isn't guarding my recovery. She's strictly administering my complete inability. My lucidity, that tiny thread of a working mind, quickly figured out the routine. The heaviest, most debilitating drugs were given exactly when an outsider, a nurse, a lawyer, a distant relative was about to visit, or immediately after a session of demanding physical therapy that could accidentally expose my improvement. Bethany's goal wasn't just physical constraint. It was the total control of my cognitive ability. Ensuring my status as incompetent to make legal decisions was always the medical truth. I tried writing. With profound effort and a hidden pen I snagged during a lapse in her vigilance, I managed to scrawl a simple sentence on the corner of a utility bill. "Help me. Bethany is lying." The next morning, the pen was gone. The utility bill was filed cleanly, replaced by a soft-lined pad designed only for therapeutic doodles, too fuzzy for serious lines. She didn't accuse me, she just managed the resources. She had placed the total surveillance net over my intellectual tools. The full weight of my situation, my utter helplessness, became a psychological scream in my silence. My life savings, the complete product of a career dedicated to high-level, precise administration, was locked. My control was completely gone, and Bethany had sealed the outside world, telling everyone that my condition had created a necessary and total isolation period for uninterrupted recovery. The most chilling part of her operation was the absolute sincerity she exuded to the few professionals she allowed inside the gate. She played the role of the devoted guardian with an integrity that defied suspicion. But one area of my life was not easily controlled by medication: my hands. My life for 7 decades had involved textiles, needlework, and a sophisticated, meticulous devotion to fine, abstract art created by knitting and sewing. Complex work that required discipline and thousands of memorized codified stitches. This was my sanctuary, the place my precise, controlling nature always found peace. After my second stroke, Bethany encouraged the practice, calling it excellent motor therapy and comforting distraction. She bought me a colossal roll of soft, unbleached cotton backing and mountains of colored yarn, her explicit instruction: I must finish the final community comfort quilt, a complex, abstract textile designed for charity that had been started 2 years ago. The rules were simple: no distractions, follow the pattern, fill the silence with the needle. This enormous, ambitious textile became my reason to maintain my cognitive strength in secret. I realized then that my final, absolute stand against the cage of her affection couldn't be spoken. It had to be stitched. My new job was to transform this innocent, comforting community comfort quilts, an artifact of benign old age, into a dense, functional, silent cry for help. I used the only language she couldn't recognize: textile cryptography. The base idea came from an ancient historical record I once reviewed in a small European museum: Civil War-era women communicating wartime information via stitching patterns. I quickly devised a system based on my own memory of knot variations, thread colors, and geometric pattern repeats, using tiny Morse code sewn discreetly into the texture. A single color change wasn't random, it was a character. A pattern change wasn't an aesthetic choice, it was a shift in tone or instruction. This entire project, the only thing keeping me sane, was now the physical representation of my locked consciousness. I began my daily deception, performing the role of the diligently recovering stroke patient while meticulously, surgically, stitching an irreversible, detailed, undeniable record of her abuse into the very fabric of the final textile. My first encoded line, stitched in subtle dark blue thread across a large central square, was simple but necessary: BINDSME. She binds me. A record of my immediate predicament. The next step had to be to prove that her actions were not medical protection, but intentional financial exploitation. I needed to find a direct record of her personal gain and link it to a tangible name that would trigger an immediate intervention by authorities who wouldn't just hear my whispers, but would understand the immediate threat to their bottom line. Bethany's cruelty, her meticulous care and control, was no longer merely psychological warfare. It was her life support system. And my hands, deemed only fit for passive therapeutic arts, were preparing the only evidence strong enough to blow up her entire world and expose her devastating, half-a-century-old lie. The key to her true motivation was an antique gold locket she wore almost constantly, an heirloom from her estranged, unseen, distant brother, Michael. I had only glanced at it once in 40 years, but the design, a rare family crest I instantly recognized, confirmed a shocking past I'd intentionally buried. I was not simply confronting a mercenary friend. I was confronting a vengeful ghost. My silent fight was about to open up a tragedy I had been complicit in creating 40 years ago. The threads I was stitching were about to unravel my entire adult life. The heavy truth of Bethany's calculated affection, the discovery of Harold's locket, and the realization of a 50-year slow-burn revenge transformed my silence into an active weapon. I had to become the artist of deception, carefully unweaving the cage she'd so lovingly built around me. My biggest asset was my regained memory, a strength I acquired simply by no longer swallowing the pills she administered to dull my brain. My daily medication cycle became a cold, intense poker game. She trusted my incompetence completely, which made my performance of a slow, unsteady recovery essential. Each morning, I would swallow a portion of the harmless vitamins, but the tiny, crucial cognitive suppressant capsule, the one that made my speech slurred and my movements frustratingly slow, I would carefully hide beneath the intricate folds of my quilt. The fiber of the cloth was now my sanctuary, holding the secrets that would bring her down. The need to communicate the severity of the situation within the quilt became paramount. It wasn't enough to just record the present. I had to weave in the dark history. I used a specific, almost hidden pattern of small double-loop knots to document the times of her greatest control, the moments she checked her locks or administered the heaviest doses, the equivalent of documenting a hostage's schedule on the thread itself. These knots were entirely inconspicuous, hiding the rhythm of my captivity. But my investigation wasn't only on the thread, it was on paper. Bethany's arrogance guaranteed her carelessness. Her main desk for paperwork, though orderly, was full of vulnerabilities I'd once dismissed. I needed to know the nature of her financial gain, how deep the exploitation of my assets truly was.
My moment came during the frantic midday rush of one Tuesday. Bethany received an important, urgent call that sent her to the far corner of the living room, whispering intensely about seized accounts and a delayed transfer code. It was an unmissable sound vacuum, a chance I wouldn't get again. With profound, silent effort, I deployed a technique I hadn't used in months, the simple, straight maneuver of the right hand. I used the light, delicate hook I normally employed for delicate yarn weaving to hook the keycard hanging loosely from her apron pocket, snagging the flimsy lanyard in a movement so practiced it almost defied her sight, and securing the keycard into the large folds of my silk robe. I had exactly 20 minutes before she needed the card for the next staff sign-off. The filing cabinet, which I silently crept to, held the key to the betrayal. It wasn't a dusty old box. It was a pristine new unit she'd ordered precisely for the control of my life. I opened it with the ease of a master administrative clerk reclaiming her own files. The files screened the terrible reality of the fraud, not simple embezzlement, but a sophisticated full legal preparation for a total asset transfer. Bethany had not merely been stealing petty cash. She was moving entire sections of my considerable trust fund into an offshore shell entity disguised as an administrative management endowment for a third-party estate attorney. A recent codicil, waiting only for my medical stabilization signature, explicitly transferred total power and executorship to her. A blatant multi-million-dollar asset theft executed under the clean white cloth of her caregiving integrity. This financial trail led straight back to a second villain. The deeply negligent physician, Dr. Henderson, the specialist who systematically authorized the escalating toxic suppressants in my daily regimen. Her name was on every authorization form I examined. Dr. Henderson was the necessary legal firewall, the signature of authority that made my incarceration medically necessary, and Bethany's theft legally compliant. They had orchestrated the perfect financial kidnapping, protected by medical privilege. I could have called the police, but my words, if I managed them, would be met by Dr. Henderson's files and Bethany's impeccable testimony against the confused stroke patient. I had to continue the silent audit. I secured a single sheet of documentation, the complete authorization list from Dr. Henderson for all my current drug dosages and chemical suppressants, tucking it into a tiny folded section of my large robe that she would never think to examine. I placed the keycard precisely back on the apron pocket as she left the soundproof booth, catching her nervous glance perfectly. The danger I ran was enormous, but the weight of the evidence I gained was final. The horror of her deceit fueled my final desperate communicative act. The entire murder plot wasn't a crime of sudden opportunity. It was a crime of decades-long resentment, a slow poison. I returned to my quilting, focusing all the new fury into the single act that could save my sanity and my life. I created the gold thread final sentence. Using a single spool of shimmering gold yarn representing the vastness of the betrayal, I began the intricate process of creating the coded message. I knew the threat wasn't over. My nephew Michael, the honest one, had to understand the deep complexity of the danger, far beyond just bad pills. I wove in the history of the locket. Harold's murder equals trust lie, ensuring the motivation of betrayal would not be dismissed as geriatric confusion. My physical weakness meant my time for simple words was over. Only the complete narrative stitched into my fabric could work now. The final element of her trap became brutally clear the following morning. Bethany entered with a single, highly suspicious leather briefcase. She smiled, but her eyes held a new intense focus. The time of extraction was set. "Good news, darling. The estate attorney has scheduled an official signing next week. We're moving to secure some non-liquid assets for protection. A complex transfer to safeguard your future. Just a few papers." I knew the reality instantly. This wasn't protection, it was the final, immediate, massive transfer of control. She wasn't waiting for my demise. She was closing the vault on my conscious life and sealing her ownership over the majority of my remaining wealth. Her sudden change of tactics proved she was on high alert, knowing that control over the accounts would be lost if I, the actual owner, had a sudden surge of competency. She saw the writing on the wall. The minute I gained a strong voice, she would be completely lost. My time to alert the world was over. My time to escape had already passed. Now, the single thread that separated my liberation from a final dark sentence lay solely on my final communicative act, Michael and the quilt. I had to get the coded quilt into his hands because he was the only external factor who could read the honesty behind the threads.
The realization that the silent asset transfer, the final economic blow, was scheduled to happen next week gave me a terrifying jolt of adrenaline. My window of resistance was hours, not days. Bethany's focus on the signed paperwork was absolute. The medical system she had built, Dr. Henderson's authorized chemical silence, was entirely geared toward preventing any physical, vocal, or even emotional defense from my side. I began my execution plan, moving beyond observation and into calculated defiance. My life and her arrest depended entirely on my ability to transmit the full, terrible narrative woven into the quilt to Michael and to make him understand that my slurred speech was performance art, not permanent paralysis. My challenge was complex. I had to deliver the confession, the quilt, to Michael without Bethany recognizing the object's true nature and without triggering the state police before I had a fully verified, coherent witness. My opportunity came when Michael scheduled his next mandatory weekly visit, an event Bethany always monitored but rarely prevented. My goal, complete the subtle code that was meant to be the delivery instruction. I worked furiously, straining my returned muscle memory to finalize the last piece of my artistic defiance, the black-threaded Morse code pattern that spelled out "Urgent Exam Quilt Fingerprint" on the edges of the cloth. This single sentence contained everything: the urgency, the asset, the quilt, and the means to legally force the investigation, the fingerprint, a simple external check he could run on my arrest. Michael arrived. He saw my frailty and was heartbroken. He noticed the intensity of Bethany's rigid, attentive posture. Bethany positioned herself, as always, directly between me, the door, and the end of my wheelchair where the quilt lay on my lap. Her full vigilance was aimed at preventing a physical outburst. She wasn't worried about words, just a shove. The protocol I executed was risky based on our childhood communication. As he hugged me gently, I pushed the only clue I had. I pressed my hand not onto his shoulder, but directly onto his wrist, forcing my finger against a specific pattern of his watch's small metallic bezel, using our simple tap code from our teenage years. I communicated a single, terrifying instruction: search coat. He gave no visible reaction. He was professional, composed. He continued his gentle, quiet talk, allowing Bethany's calm veneer to return. The transfer of the evidence itself required a massive staging. I initiated a classic stroke patient confusion scenario. I reached out, my entire hand trembling violently, an effect easily produced now by skipping 2 essential stabilizing pills, and grabbed his light jacket which he'd placed on a nearby mahogany coat rack. I pulled the jacket down clumsily, burying my face into the material and making pathetic muffled noises, weeping incoherently, performing the complete collapse of emotional distress she was expecting. Bethany sprang into immediate action, focused on controlling the visible noise and distress. Her absolute priority was comforting me and getting the highly distressed man, Michael, out of the room quietly. She completely failed to notice the 2 things that transpired simultaneously within that millisecond of genuine confusion. First, I released the hidden envelope containing the authorization lists for all my bank accounts and financial safety records I had kept with me, subtly allowing them to slip into the depths of Michael's coat pockets, the total evidence of my wealth. And second, and far more critical, I subtly pushed the edge of the finished, meticulously rolled quilt so it hooked around Michael's chair leg. Bethany gently ushered Michael toward the front door, offering him a nervous water bottle and urging him to drive safely, her focus only on the speed of his departure. Michael, worried and apologetic, was led directly away. The staged medical emergency successfully cleared the evidence, secured the key holder, Michael, and ensured a brief window for my safe removal. He drove away without a single physical clue, except for the evidence trailing from his car. The single essential object, the community comfort quilt, with its dense pattern of abuse and golden threads of murder, was dragged from the room with perfect force by his car tire on the gravel driveway, trailing a massive cloud of silent, powerful evidence into the outside world. I watched it go, feeling an immense, painful surge of liberation and terror. The moment the confession was outside my wall of confinement, my true safety evaporated. The inevitable consequence of my desperate act followed within minutes. Bethany discovered her loss. She first checked the floor, finding only a stray bit of thread. Then she checked my desk drawer, and finally she saw the large, exposed patch of bare wood on the floor where the rolled quilt had sat. The sheer horror of her eyes when she understood that the single most potent source of my cognitive sanity and evidence, the complete narrative of her betrayal, was gone and out in the hands of the world, was a profound and lasting vision. She didn't scream about the law. She didn't shout about theft. She screamed about the quilt itself. The threads, the knots, you vile, hateful creature. She knew instantly that her beautiful tapestry of lies was destroyed. Her entire rage, unhinged and pure, was now aimed at securing the last shred of the life she'd worked 5 decades for. My life. I knew her next act would be her final, most desperate move, an act to erase all remaining medical evidence and secure a definitive end. I lay perfectly still in the middle of my silent room, prepared to face her final, desperate choice, the immediate obliteration of all the evidence and me. The silence was over. The brutal game was ready for its end. The moment Bethany realized the quilt, my total narrative of 5 decades of crime and betrayal was gone. The polite veneer of the caregiver dissolved entirely. Her face, usually so perfectly controlled, was a landscape of pure, unadulterated, raw hatred. She had built her life, her power, and her final massive financial goal on the belief that my meticulous nature would be confined to her surveillance. My ability to stitch the truth had exposed the unforgivable sin. Her first, final act was to silence the truth forever. She rushed to my medical cart, pulling out a syringe, not the standard dose, but an unmarked opaque vial. Her intention was terrifyingly clear, not to suppress me, but to eliminate the inconvenient witness immediately and make it look like a tragic terminal spike in my neurological symptoms. Her 40 years of devotion ended with the primal urgency of a killer cornered in their own elaborate trap. She advanced, muttering not legal threats, but the genuine agony of her broken, secret heart. "He was mine, Elvira. He loved my heart, not your money and your surface. This is for the woman you made me abandon 50 years ago." The truth of her jealousy and her prolonged revenge solidified the moral certainty in my mind. I could not fight her physical strength, but I could still wield the ultimate power of my returned sanity. I knew the single absolute weakness of her current frenzied state. As she came close, needle ready, I didn't defend myself physically. Instead, I used my strongest, clearest, newly restored voice for the single sentence that contained all the final authority I possessed. I forced the words out, crisp and utterly whole, a complete release of the suppressed mind. "Bethany, Harold didn't choose me. Your letter caused his accident. You are killing me for a death you caused." The words shattered her completely. She stopped mid-stride, the syringe wavering near my neck. Her entire psychological structure, the years of justified victimhood and controlled revenge, crumbled instantly. I continued the counterattack, using the one truth I found in my oldest diary, a subtle detail she thought I'd forgotten long ago. "That letter of denouncement, you sent it the night before the sailing accident. He was meeting the boat owner to sell everything and disappear with you, not with me. He needed the cash to protect you from his family, and you broke him by cutting the single thread he was holding on to." The needle dropped to the floor, forgotten. Bethany stood in total silence, her world reduced to that one moment of desperate truth. The crushing knowledge that the betrayal that fueled her life, the hatred that drove her to slow murder, was founded entirely on her own self-inflicted error and paranoia. Her rage wasn't pure. It was self-deception, finally exposed. She stood weeping, a defeated murderer staring into the abyss of her own monstrous actions. The ensuing scene, a massive cacophony of immediate and violent professional action, was timed to absolute perfection. Michael did not drive the quote to the authorities. My warning in the garden and my life of subtle communication meant he executed an immediate cold tactical maneuver. He simply took the quilt out of the bag on the gravel and, using his concealed pocket knife, precisely executed the single, ultimate command I stitched in black thread. He cut the diagonal thread pattern.
That one cut released the envelope I placed there hours before, the simple authorization for a legal health crisis audit. Michael then initiated the call not to the local police, but to the Specialized Elder Care Protective Services legal office in Seattle, the only body with the statutory authority to bypass Bethany's control and demand the intervention of state police and to bring with them a clean, honest, independent medical team. They arrived minutes later. The authorities burst into the house just as Bethany, immobilized by the devastating truth, had fully collapsed on the floor. The ensuing scene was swift, powerful, and definitive. The state authorities seized my full medical records before Bethany could touch them and her personal financial computer, all on a simple search warrant initiated by the Protective Services attorney armed with Michael's cut quilt, the seized truth of intentional physical abuse. Dr. Henderson, alerted by a panicked call, arrived only to find her signature evidence used against her. The escalating dosage forms proved immediate and blatant neglect, and she was summarily suspended by the authorities right in the hallway. Bethany's reign was over.
My recovery was brutal, lengthy, and complete. Within months, I had completely stabilized under competent medical supervision, proving what I knew all along. I was physically sound, and my aphasia was, in large part, chemically manufactured. My revenge was delivered not by a checkbook, but by a massive act of ultimate administrative and moral competence. I officially reinstated all my legal power of attorney, firing the legal team that failed me, the accounting firm that questioned me, and ensuring Dr. Henderson and Bethany were successfully charged with conspiracy, medical malfeasance, and massive attempted fraud. The charge of Harold's murder was kept silent, a private truth, as the legal burden of a 50-year-old nautical tragedy was deemed secondary to the act of criminal exploitation. Bethany was sentenced to 15 years in prison for organized medical fraud and physical endangerment. The woman who sought ultimate social superiority was reduced to a number and a prison uniform, her long life of malice ending in profound public humiliation and the total destruction of her persona. My final victory was internal. I was officially the owner of my life and my body. I made the single, unilateral move that gave my final life its meaning. I gave my total financial life to my quiet, resourceful nephew. I granted Michael full executorship of the Vance Trust, transferring control of the vast majority of my assets into his name and care. He accepted the monumental trust with the silent dignity he possessed, and I now live with him and his small family in absolute security, with the only true friendship I possess being that of my own blood. The community comfort quilt, my terrifying masterpiece of suffering and surveillance, was retired from evidence and hangs, preserved under glass in Michael's house, not as a decoration, but as a permanent monument to the price of contempt. I have regained most of my speech. I speak not to apologize, but to narrate my truth. My name is Eleanor Vance. My beautiful home, once a cage of hatred, is gone, but my heart is free. My peace was purchased not with money, but with the brutal necessity of revealing the darkest, deepest truth about a 5-decade betrayal. My stitched word proved to be stronger than any locked vault.